Good morning, everyone. As you can see by the slide, I'm Nick. Thanks, John. One of Secure Data's pre-sales consultants based in the north, and I'm going to talk to you today about threat detection. And to do this, I'd like to start by outlining the cyber world that we live in today to set the context of our story. And it's by way of an analogy that associates itself with our South African heritage of our founders, Etienne, our CTO, and Charles, our chief strategist. And the analogy goes that in South Africa, every morning a lioness wakes up and knows that she has to run down the gazelle in order to eat and live. Meanwhile, the gazelle wakes up and knows it must outrun the lioness in order to survive. So what happens every morning is everyone wakes up and everyone starts running. And this analogy used in cybersecurity, it holds a lot of truisms. We believe that we are the lionesses and we believe that the lionesses are the bad guys and we're the gazelles and we have to run away from that lioness. And so we're constantly running. We're running from vulnerabilities to patches, from threats to remediation, from breach to response, from audit to compliance. And so this idea of running is really something that defines our lives in cybersecurity. This analogy, because we think in terms of analogies, has a lot of power in terms of shaping our thinking and behaviour. One of the impacts is, apart from encouraging us to run all the time, that it creates this belief that we can, if we just run fast enough, that we can get away from this lioness, or even worse, that we don't have to run fast enough, that we only have to outrun our competitors or our contemporaries, because that lioness will always go for the slowest gazelle. As we know from news streams of consistent breaches and compromises, that way of thinking quite simply isn't working out for us. The lioness seems to be winning on a continuous basis, and increasingly so, with views being put forward as to why that is and what we have to do to run faster and better. For example, the need for better technology, better people, better standards, more recently better threat intelligence. But some people are just saying as an industry that we suck. But we have a slightly different thought in Secure Data, in that maybe if we change the way we think about things and reassess some of these analogies, that it'll shape our thinking and behaviour in a more positive way. So at Secure Data, we've been arguing in favour of a slightly different analogy, and that's that cybersecurity is more like running with the bulls than running from the lions. You imagine this scenario in Pamplona, where all the runners are held up with bulls on narrow roads, which is an environment which is filled with risk, danger, imminent threat, but also one that's characterised by chaos. And your intent and purpose as a runner has much less bearing on the likelihood that you're going to succeed. This challenging environment to us is shaped by things like rapidly changing threat landscape, the pressure of businesses to transform digitally, and of course the impact on regulations. Only on Tuesday, the latest example being Google's £44 million GDPR fine. Now, with this analogy in mind, we can draw a new truism, which is that you can outrun some of the bulls some of the time, provided that you stay on this road for long enough, which is what we all have to do in cybersecurity, but you can't outrun all the bulls all the time. So successful compromise, if we bring it back to cybersecurity, it's basically inevitable, and the reality that we should all be thinking about. Recent news, it makes it clear to us that it happens to the best, brightest, biggest, strongest, and when it's happening, it's having increasing real consequences in terms of market reputation, market value, direct financial cost. And so there's this sense that if we accept this analogy, that as defenders we're almost up against overwhelming odds. Now, Secure Data argue that these overwhelming odds are the function multiple of not only technological advancement, but growing sophistication as the threat actor. Really, by these high-level meta trends which are shaping the world that we live in today, over the last 2 or 3 years, we've been talking about what these meta factors look like and how they influence the world of cybersecurity that we operate in. What I want to do is just take out one example to illustrate this, which is the one that's highlighted government spending on offensive cyber. Now, this is a long story which we've run entire talks on, but I just want to share some examples which are illustrated by these images. You start off with a hacking tool called Internal Blue or Double Pulsar, which is secretly developed and used by the NSA probably around about 5 years ago. It's then leaked out by a Russian intelligence front operation called the Shadow Brokers. This is then used by the North Koreans to build and execute WannaCry, and that impact is then observed by the Russians, then reformed into NotPetya, which as we saw had a $300 million impact on Maersk. A very quick story of a very quick version of a very long story demonstrates how directly, as a result of government spending and government investment in cybersecurity, specifically offensive cyber hacking tools, we as a civilian industry are faced with threats and problems that we've never been faced with before and are proven incapable of responding to. To illustrate that even further, the story of the Saudi activist Khashoggi killed by the Saudis as part of the story, which has a cyber angle, and it goes that apparently text messages between him and a friend in Canada were intercepted by the Saudis and monitored. It's believed that the monitoring these text messages had a direct role to play in his eventual assassination. The Saudis were able to do this because they bought and used a hacking tool developed by an Israeli company called the NSO Group. And it's a text message on the screen that was allegedly used to infect the iPhone in Canada and deploy the malware onto the phone. And through this malware, they were able to track the messages, which ultimately had a part to play in Khashoggi's death. Now, why this is also really interesting is because what the Saudis allegedly paid for that malware was in the region of $55 million. That's what the Saudis were prepared to pay to achieve their political objectives. Now, why this story is important? My screen's not working, guys, so I'm gonna double check it's still working. Why that story is important is that kind of money fills an industry which has an economy which we in the private sector can barely compete with. Here on the screen is a bounty being paid by exploit brokers Zerodium, originally offering £1 million for a remote iOS exploit, but now from the latest price list, they're paying $2 million. So what we're faced with in the civilian space is an industry that's willing to pay up to $2 million for a remote iOS exploit and get in return for that up to $50 million for a workable exploit framework. Now, you can imagine the impact that has on offensive industry relative to that of the poultry budgets that we have to work with on the defensive side. So what that does when you put it all together is create this huge inflationary effect. You've got cyber criminals looking for new ways to make money. You've got new forms of cybercrime largely fueled by cryptocurrency, which enable the movement of money underground. Then you've got this inflationary effect from the investment of government into hacking tools, which result in things like WannaCry and NotPetya. We believe that these are ultimately just the tip of the iceberg, and it creates a very difficult environment for the average customer to operate safely in. But of course, it's not all doom and gloom, and we shouldn't all just pack up and go home. The defenders, they're not sitting still. There is pushback. There are efforts to secure businesses, even in an environment like this. There's this sort of realization and acceptance, almost an empathy, that it's hard for businesses like Maersk, that although on the one hand that they may have been somewhat negligent, that they're increasingly being seen as victims. But questions are still asked when breaches happen, and like whether businesses are applying appropriate due diligence. So it's okay to be a victim, so long as you're checking all the boxes. But one of those boxes that's absolutely expected to be checked is detection. So, you ask, one of the questions asked about the Yahoo breach was not so much as to how did it happen, but how did it go unnoticed for so long? And increasingly that kind of behaviour is considered unforgivable. Now, one of the arguments put forward to why detection is so hard is because it would have been hard if we were looking for a needle in a haystack, but really it's more like looking for a needle in a needle stack. So it's almost like this impossible thing for us to detect compromise within our networks. We know that an average customer's time to detection is something like 150 days, and that predominantly they aren't detected by the companies themselves, but moreover the third parties who became aware of malware activities from within corporate networks. And so detection is described as almost this impossible thing. There's been a fundamental balance in cybersecurity favouring the attacker. In its simplest form, the defender has to get it right all the time, whereas the attacker all has to get it right once. But it's only partly true, because actually, over the years, we've come to understand a lot about how the bad guy works, the tactics, the techniques and procedures that are increasingly well understood and described to help us rebalance that scale, which previously favoured the attacker. One of the ways they describe this is through this Lockheed Martin kill chain, which catches all the steps that an attacker must go through to effect a successful compromise. We know that, and if we know what to look for, it helps rebalance that scale back in the favour of the defenders. For example, an attacker doesn't know what your environment looks like and has to perform certain tasks to understand the environment that they're in. For example, establish command and control with a machine, which would in turn make that attack visible. So there's increasingly an acceptance or a rebalance that we're no longer looking for a needle in a needle stack, that we do have a sense of what it is that we're looking for. In the industry now, fixed standards are now emerging to capture exactly what that looks like. This is from MITRE, and it captures exactly that. All the things that we could look to see an attacker doing through each phase of the kill chain, which gives us a clear sense of what it is we're looking for in a very clear and objective way to assess what we can and can't see. One very good example that secure data like the use of is the use of deception and traps. What we're looking at here is something called a honey token, which is a document which is injected with a highly covert callback mechanism, and that simply notifies our managed SIEM when it's triggered. So what we're able to do with these honey tokens is sprinkle them around the environment, knowing that an attacker is going to be fishing around looking for interesting and valuable intelligence, and when the document's opened, it notifies our managed SIEM. It's an example of how we can tip that balance in our favour as defenders to detect attackers within our environment. It's cheap, it's easy, and it's very, very effective. So we can see that there's definitively a place for detection in a mature defensive strategy. And it's a very nice notion that you can stand up on a watcher on a wall, if you like. You've got all of these walls that you can stand up on, looking in and out of, watching out for this type of activity so that you can carry on focusing on your business activities. The watcher on the wall is a complement to the wall. You can't have a watcher without a wall, but also the wall is much less useful without a watcher. So, in summary, there are three strong reasons for having detection as part of your strategy. The first is the one we just touched on. Any good multi-layer defense in-depth strategy needs to have some sort of visibility, asking yourself the question of, are we doing everything we can to see what's going on in and around our network? The second is from a compliance point of view. It's increasingly an expectation that businesses should be meeting regulatory compliance and adhering to best practice. And three, when a breach does occur, you want to be ready to go through and extract the data you need from the environment in order to understand how the breach occurred, as well as the impact and the scope of that breach. That's three, sorry. And the analysts, whilst it's dated to 2017, they do agree with this. There are many, many other analysts that agree with this approach. So what we see at Secure Data is not an elephant in an office. What we see is that a mature defensive strategy involves combining all these elements. You're starting out with assessing what a threat landscape looks like, then adding protective mechanisms to cover off those threats. Then you're using detective mechanisms to detect when stuff still gets through defences. Then finally having a response program in place so that you're ready to act when something is detected. Now, all of these fully depend on understanding what your attack surface looks like. And so essentially, so we need all three of these. We need all of these things: assess, detect, protect, and respond. But we need to use them in a very strategic way to cover off as much of the threat landscape as we can. So if you buy into the idea that a detection strategy can help strengthen your defences, how does that play out in practice? Well, for a business defender looking to deploy some sort of detection capability in their environment, there is a broad summary of 5 approaches, each of which has strengths and weaknesses. And there was what we call broad source SIEM, meaning that you're taking and correlating lots of logs from lots of different places. There's the endpoint-centric stuff, which depends on having agents installed. There's the evolution of IDS, which looks at traffic on the wire, but it's very dependent on machine learning to reduce the number of false positives. Then there's the deception and honeypots, which we touched on. These are very effective, but provide no context. Once a trap's triggered, you don't know how the attacker got there. Then there's UEBA, which is increasingly been assimilated into these other approaches, although Johnny at Fire at Zone Fox would probably disagree with that approach. No matter what approach you take, in the end, it depends on what we would call the core values. And the core is the ability to build, maintain the 4 Ps, which is people, platform, process, and projects. And unless these can be understood, these can be stood up, maintained and managed, the technology that you use ultimately is going to end up being ineffective. And for the purpose of today's talk, I want to draw your attention to probably the most difficult and most central of these, which is, of course, people. What this article illustrates is a story about the US Marine Corps, which traditionally has insisted that every soldier first goes through basic training. It doesn't matter what you do in the Marines, you first do basic training, and so the saying is that every Marine is a rifleman. But in 2017, the proposed exemption to that was specifically for cyber skills, to allow them to hire directly from the private industry into the Marine Corps for specialised cyber skills, because they realise they just can't get the talent that they need. So these types of dramatic changes in the Marine Corps highlight just how real that challenge is and finding cyber defence skills are. Without these skills, none of the technologies you select are going to work effectively. And whilst high turnover businesses may have more money to carry out cyber security functions in-house, the findings actually suggest that high turnover businesses are more likely to outsource cyber security. And so this introduces the notion of managed threat detection, and 3 main reasons that we argue for this. The first that we just spoke about, the 4 Ps. They're very difficult to build and maintain, and generally not a core capability, especially for small businesses. The second is what we just touched on now, it's skill. An analyst needs to be a highly capable specialist. It's very difficult to try to appoint, train and maintain this kind of talent. And the third is agility. The third is agility. You can't just do it once as the threat landscape is changing so dramatically. You have to be able to adapt the detection capabilities on an ongoing basis, which is again very difficult for the average business to do. And this brings us to the value proposition of what someone like Secure Data can bring to the party. And if I can take a moment just to express what we think we offer in the marketplace, is that one, we have a real commitment to getting the basics right. Detection only works when it's consistent. You have to get it right all the time. Consistency is a balance of skill and discipline, and we're very committed to getting the basics right in a very transparent way so that our customers can see what we're doing and how we're doing it. 2 is scope. We believe in an all-source approach, which means we don't depend on any one source of intel to detect attacks. We use multiple data sources from multiple different data sources. We use multiple data sources from multiple systems, which maximise the probability that we'll see something when it happens. And 3 is what we call fit. We believe for SMEs in the market, we provide a unique balance between the level of capability that we can bring, which is world-class, but a relative size that makes us directly accessible to our clients. For example, if you see our CTO and founder Etienne speaking at the RSA conference next month in the States, you'll also meet with Etienne when engaging at a pre-sales level. Also Vikas, who's also speaking at RSA, it's Vikas who's doing the threat hunting for you. So our team of dedicated researchers are globally recognised and frequently showcased at these international security events and in leading publications, and their exceptional skills and their unrivaled experience impact directly on our operations and are made accessible through the products and services that we offer. And that today, guys, is actually the end of my story, and so thank you for your time and attention. If you have any questions for me, I'll be on the stand. Thank you very much.